In December 1944, thousands of American paratroopers were rushed into Belgium with no winter clothing, little ammunition, and almost no time to prepare. They were told to hold a small road town called Bastogne. Within days, German tanks surrounded them from every side. There was no clear escape route, no proper supply line, no promise that help would arrive in time. And when the Germans demanded their surrender, the answer from inside the town became one of the most famous words of the Second World War. But before that moment came, the men of Bastogne had to survive the trap, a quiet front that suddenly exploded. By the middle of December 1944, many Allied soldiers believed the war in Europe was entering its final stage. Paris had been liberated. Allied armies had crossed France. German forces had been pushed back toward their own border. For some American units, the Ardennes seemed like a quiet sector, a place where tired divisions could rest, reorganize, and recover after months of fighting. The Ardennes was a region of forests, hills, narrow roads, and small villages. In winter, it could feel almost forgotten. The roads were icy. The woods were dark. Fog and low clouds often covered the sky. It did not look like the place where Germany would launch its last major offensive in the West. But that was exactly why Adolf Hitler chose it. The German plan was bold and desperate. Armored divisions would break through the thin American lines in the Ardennes, race west toward the Meuse River, and then drive toward Antwerp. If they reached Antwerp, they could split the Allied armies in two. British and Canadian forces would be cut off in the north. American forces would be pushed back in the south. It was a huge gamble. Germany was running short of fuel, men, aircraft, and time. But Hitler believed one powerful strike could still change the war. The attack began before dawn on December 16, 1944. German artillery opened fire across the forest. Infantry moved through the mist. Tanks rolled down narrow roads between the trees. American units at the front were hit hard, and in many places they were overwhelmed. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and at the center of the storm stood one town, Bastogne. Why Bastogne mattered? Bastogne was not a large city. It was not a major industrial center. It did not have a famous fortress or a huge river crossing, but it had something more important in the Ardennes: roads. 7 main roads met in and around Bastogne. In a region where forests and hills made movement difficult, roads were everything. Tanks needed roads. Trucks carrying fuel needed roads. Artillery needed roads. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements all needed roads. For the German offensive to keep moving west, Bastogne had to be taken. If the Americans held the town, German armor would be forced to move around it through smaller, slower routes. That would cost time. And time was the one thing the German offensive did not have. The German attack had to move fast before the Allies could react. It had to outrun American reserves. It had to make use of bad weather because Allied aircraft were grounded by clouds and fog. Every hour mattered, so Bastogne became more than a town. It became a roadblock, and the men sent to hold that roadblock were not supposed to be there. The 101st is rushed to the front. The 101st Airborne Division had been pulled back to France after heavy fighting in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. The men were exhausted. Many had lost friends. Many units were still rebuilding. Replacements were arriving. Equipment was being repaired. The division was not fully ready for another major battle. Then the German offensive struck. The order came quickly: move to Belgium. There was no time for perfect preparation. Men packed what they could. Some did not have proper winter coats. Many still wore standard field jackets, not enough for the freezing Ardennes. Some had no overshoes. Some had little more than thin gloves. They were paratroopers, but they did not jump into Bastogne. They went by truck. Long convoys moved north through the cold. The men sat in open vehicles, wrapped in blankets, trying to sleep between stops. Some had no idea exactly where they were going. Others heard rumors of a major German breakthrough, of tanks behind the lines, of entire American units cut off. For many, this was not their first battle. The 101st had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. They had fought through hedgerows, villages, and flooded fields. They had fought again in the Netherlands. But Bastogne would be different. There would be no parachute drop, no clear drop zone, no planned landing behind enemy lines. This time, they were being thrown straight into the path of a German armored offensive. They arrived around Bastogne on December 18th and 19th. At first, the situation was confused. Roads were crowded with retreating American vehicles, refugees, supply trucks, and units trying to find their commands. German spearheads were moving fast. Communication was poor. Nobody had a perfect map of the battle. The 101st began taking positions around the town, forming a defensive ring. They were joined by other American units, including combat engineers, artillerymen, tank destroyer crews, and survivors from formations hit during the first days of the German attack. Together, they would become the defenders of Bastogne, the men inside the perimeter. The story of Bastogne is often told as the story of the 101st Airborne alone, and the 101st was at the center of it. But the town was held by a mixture of units. There were paratroopers from the 501st, 502nd, 506th, and 327th Glider Infantry. There were artillery units. There were engineers from the 10th Armored Division. There were elements of the 9th and 10th Armored. There were medical teams, clerks, truck drivers, cooks, mechanics, and men who suddenly found themselves carrying rifles in the snow. Many of the first armored soldiers to arrive had helped slow the German advance before the Airborne Division fully organized its positions. Their fight bought precious time. One of the key American commanders inside Bastogne was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He was acting commander of the 101st because Major General Maxwell Taylor was away in the United States. McAuliffe was not the kind of man who needed theatrical speeches. He was direct, calm, and practical. In a battle that quickly became chaotic, that mattered. The defensive perimeter around Bastogne was roughly shaped like an uneven circle. Different regiments held different sectors. Villages around the town became key points: Noville, Foix, Marville, Champs, Hemroul, and others. These places were not just names on a map. Each one became a small battlefield. Each one had to be held because if one fell, the road into Bastogne could open. The men dug foxholes in frozen ground. That sounds simple until you imagine it. The earth was hard as stone. Picks and shovels bounced off the surface. Men had to chip at the ground for hours to make holes deep enough to protect them. Some foxholes were barely more than shallow scrapes. Snow fell into them. Water froze at the bottom. Men slept sitting up, if they slept at all. The cold became an enemy of its own. Weapons jammed. Fingers went numb. Boots froze. Wounded men could die not only from blood loss, but from exposure. Every movement took effort. Still, the perimeter took shape. The German army was closing in. The German plan around Bastogne. The Germans understood Bastogne's importance just as clearly as the Americans did. Several German formations moved around and toward the town, including elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, and other units pushing through the Ardennes. Their goal was not simply to defeat the Americans inside Bastogne. Their larger goal was speed. They wanted to keep moving west, but Bastogne was a problem. As long as the town remained in American hands, German supply columns and armored units had to deal with a threat on their flank. The roads could not be used freely. Every delay weakened the offensive. At first, some German commanders tried to bypass Bastogne and keep moving, but the town could not be ignored forever. American forces inside the perimeter were too dangerous to leave behind. So the ring tightened. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. The men inside were cut off. There was no road open for supplies, no easy way to bring in ammunition, no way to evacuate most wounded. The weather was still terrible, so Allied aircraft could not provide much help. The defenders had what they had: and what they had was not enough. Life under siege. Once Bastogne was surrounded, the battle changed. It was no longer only about holding a line. It was about surviving hour by hour. Ammunition had to be counted. Artillery shells were rationed. Medical supplies ran low. Food was limited. Warm clothing was still a problem. Men shared blankets. They cut pieces from parachute silk and used them as scarves or insulation. The wounded suffered badly. Bastogne's aid stations were crowded with men hit by shell fragments, bullets, frostbite, and burns. Doctors and medics worked with too little morphine, too few bandages, and almost no chance to move serious cases to proper hospitals. At one point, German forces captured an American medical company, along with surgeons, nurses, and many wounded men. That loss hit the defenders hard. It meant fewer hands to treat the growing number of casualties. Outside the town, the soldiers in the foxholes listened. They heard tanks moving in the dark. They heard German voices in the woods. They heard artillery shells passing overhead before exploding behind them. They heard wounded men calling for help in places no one could safely reach. For the paratroopers, this was not like Normandy or Holland. In those battles, movement had been constant. Here, they were locked in place. Hold the line. Wait. Endure. At night, German patrols probed the perimeter. During the day, artillery and mortars hit the villages and roads. Sometimes, German infantry attacked through fog or snow, trying to find weak points. The defenders pushed them back again and again. But each attack cost ammunition. Each shell fired could not be replaced, and every man knew it. Noville, the fight that slowed the panzers. One of the most important early fights took place north of Bastogne, near the village of Noville. There, American forces, including paratroopers and tanks, fought to slow German armored units moving toward the town. A key part of this defense involved Team de Sobry, a small task force led by Major Charles de Sobry of the 10th Armored Division. His mixed force of tanks, infantry, tank destroyers, and paratroopers moved into Noville and held it against powerful German attacks. The village became a killing ground. German tanks and armored vehicles pushed toward the Americans, but the defenders used the terrain well. They fired from cover, shifted positions, and used anti-tank weapons at close range. The fighting was intense and costly. The defense of Noville did not permanently stop the Germans, but it slowed them. Every hour gained allowed more American units to settle into the Bastogne perimeter. Every delay gave the defenders time to dig, organize, and prepare. Major de Sobry's force was eventually overwhelmed, and many men were killed or captured. De Sobry himself became a prisoner, but their action mattered. In a battle where timing was everything, Noville bought time. As the siege continued, Bastogne began to mean something larger than a road junction. For the Germans, it was an obstacle that refused to disappear. For the Americans, it became a test of resolve. News of the surrounded force spread through Allied command. The weather prevented immediate relief from the air, but plans were already forming to break through on the ground. General George S. Patton's Third Army, far to the south, began turning north. That movement itself was remarkable. Patton had prepared for the possibility of a German attack and had plans ready. When ordered to help Bastogne, his army began a rapid winter march over icy roads, turning an entire fighting force toward the besieged town. But Patton's men were still far away. Inside Bastogne, the defenders could not count on rescue arriving soon. They had to hold. There was no other choice. The pressure builds. By December 21st and 22nd, the German pressure increased. The defenders were tired. The cold was getting worse. Supplies were running low. The wounded filled cellars and aid stations. Shells fell into the town. Buildings burned. Civilians trapped inside Bastogne suffered alongside the soldiers. German commanders believed the Americans were in a hopeless position. From a purely military view, the situation looked grim. Surrounded troops with limited ammunition, poor weather, and no reliable resupply often do not last long. So the Germans tried to end it with words. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a message demanding surrender. The message warned that if the Americans refused, Bastogne could face destruction. By the end of this first part, Bastogne is surrounded. The German army has failed to take the town quickly, but the Americans are still in danger. Supplies are low. The weather is still a problem. The wounded are waiting. The German attacks are growing stronger. And outside the perimeter, Patton's Third Army is fighting north through snow, ice, and resistance, trying to reach them before time runs out. Inside Bastogne, the men of the 101st Airborne and the units fighting beside them have made their choice. They will not surrender. In the next episode, we follow the battle through its hardest days, the airdrops, the Christmas attacks, the race to break the siege, and the moment. If stories like this interest you, leave a like and subscribe this channel so you don't miss the next part.